Imagine walking into a courtroom, right? But the scales of justice aren't just tipped; they're like fundamentally re-engineered,
Right.
so that the very act of just stepping before the judge registers as a confession. I mean, we operate under this comforting assumption that justice is this mechanism of precision, you know?
Yeah, exactly. Like you commit an act, the evidence is weighed, and you get a verdict based on your individual choices.
Exactly. But what happens when you step out of a traditional courtroom and into, say, a modern corporate tribunal or a university disciplinary hearing?
Or even just the broader court of public opinion.
Yeah, the foundational rules just completely evaporate. You're suddenly navigating this landscape where guilt is no longer tied to an action you performed.
Right. It's tied to the demographic category you just happen to occupy,
Hmm.
which fundamentally alters the definition of what a crime actually is.
Oh, for sure.
Because when you sever guilt from individual action and attach it to an inherited trait, you aren't administering justice anymore. You're administering like a system of biological compliance.
Wow, biological compliance. And that profound shift, how it happened, the mechanics of how it operates, and what it means for the structural integrity of our society, that is exactly what we are unpacking today.
It's a massive topic.
It really is. So, welcome to the deep dive. We are so glad you are here with us. But before we pull the thread on this, please take a second to like and subscribe to the show.
Yeah, please do.
It genuinely helps bring more of these in-depth, comprehensive analyses of, provocative, culturally significant material right to your feed.
And today is definitely provocative.
Oh, absolutely. Because today we are undertaking a sweeping review of a highly discussed new ebook. It's called Nuremberg Trials of Feminism. Anti-Racism is Racism Against Europeans, and it's by Conrad Reicher.
Right.
And look, if you follow the discourse within men's rights advocacy or, the broader manosphere, these topics generate a tremendous amount of heat.
A lot of heat, yeah.
But Reicher's book promises something entirely different. He's moving past the digital outrage to offer this clinical structural audit of how modern institutions like law, education, media, how they physically operate.
And crucially, understanding the history of those institutions before they were purportedly captured by feminist and Marxist ideologies.
Yes, that pre-capture history is so important. And if you want to dive into the primary source as we map it out, you can buy the ebook right now on Amazon, Kindle, and Google Play Books.
Highly recommend checking it out for yourself.
Yeah, and you can also follow the author at Conrad Reicher on Substack for his real-time commentary. But before we really get into it, we need to set some ground rules for today's deep dive.
Yeah, we have to be crystal clear here. Our approach today requires a very specific analytical lens.
Right.
Because the source material is highly politically charged. It touches on race, gender, law, history. And our goal is absolutely not to tell you, the listener, whether Reicher is morally right or wrong.
Exactly. We are taking no political sides here.
None. We are not endorsing his worldview, and we're not standing in opposition to it either. We're just functioning as, forensic auditors.
Right. Our sole job is to impartially report on the contents of the book. We're going to take the blueprint of Reicher's argument, spread it out on the table, and just examine the load-bearing walls.
The foundation, the wiring of his logic. We just want you to understand the exact mechanisms he describes so you can evaluate the structural integrity of these claims yourself.
Okay, so let's start with the foundation of his argument. He establishes this by drawing a really stark contrast between mid-20th century legal philosophy and today's institutional policies.
Yeah, he opens the book by anchoring us in the 1946 Nuremberg trials.
Which is an intense place to start.
It is. But to understand how institutions were captured, he insists we have to first look at how the definition of justice itself was inverted. And the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg is like the ultimate stress test for Western jurisprudence.
Right.
Reicher focuses heavily on Robert H. Jackson, who's the chief United States prosecutor. Jackson was faced with architecting a trial for literally the worst atrocities in human history.
And the temptation there, understandably, would be collective vengeance.
Exactly. But Jackson stood before that tribunal and insisted on a principle of individual adjudication. He established that no man hangs for belonging to a category, a nation, or a class.
Right. The prosecution had to prove specific, documented individual acts.
Yeah. And Reicher views this as the pinnacle of the Western legal tradition. This absolute refusal to assign collective guilt, even when the emotional justification to do so was overwhelming.
Okay, so that historical anchor is crucial. because Riker argues that modern diversity tribunals, human resources boards, equity frameworks, they've taken Jackson's foundational principle and completely inverted it.
They flipped it entirely.
Right. He claims we're now living under a system of collective inheritable guilt. According to the text, these modern institutions convict classes, specifically European men, and they punish the inheritance of birth.
Yeah, the argument is that mere existence within a specific demographic category is now treated as an oppressive act in itself.
But wait, let me push back on how he frames this for a second. Riker is essentially comparing a modern HR sensitivity training to a rigged casino, right?
Pretty much.
Where the house rules explicitly state you lose the moment you sit down. But isn't that assuming a huge level of malicious intent? I mean, most HR reps genuinely believe they are fostering a safe workplace.
Sure, but he addresses this by separating intent from mechanics.
Okay, how so?
Riker argues that the subjective intent of, say, an HR coordinator is utterly irrelevant when the structural mechanism of the institution demands a specific outcome.
Oh, I see.
He paints this vivid picture of a man standing in a modern corporate courtroom. The charge leveled against him isn't a verifiable action. The charge is his existence within a category that the corporation has predefined as oppressive.
So when the accused asks, what specific act did I commit to warrant this penalty?
The institutional apparatus basically answers, your existence within this demographic is the act.
Wow.
And Riker asserts this isn't a parody, it's the actual mechanical operating logic of modern equity doctrine. The institution doesn't need malice to execute this.
It just needs a framework where inherited traits are viewed as liabilities.
Exactly. Liabilities that require continuous mitigation.
So he tests this operating logic with something he calls the sex swap test, right?
Yeah, the sex swap test. It forces the reader to confront the mechanics of the policy without, the camouflage of cultural conditioning.
Right, so he asks the reader to imagine identical collective guilt being assigned to Jewish people for statistical overrepresentation in certain academic fields.
Or to black men for statistical disparities in the justice system.
And the immediate visceral reaction from every modern institution would be to recognize that as a profound civil rights violation.
They'd instantly identify it as collective punishment.
Right. But Riker points out, when that exact same mechanism of collective guilt is applied to European men, often under the guise of correcting historical imbalances, those same institutions call it justice.
Right. And the utility of that thought experiment is that it strips away all the philosophical rhetoric. It isolates the actual mechanism.
So Riker's argument is that a principle of justice has to be universally applicable to actually be justice.
Exactly. If a framework of collective guilt is a human rights violation when applied to demographic A and B, it logically has to remain a violation when applied to demographic C.
And if an institution applies it to demographic C anyway, while maintaining the language of fairness, then we aren't observing a philosophy of justice anymore.
Right. We're observing a raw power arrangement that's just been dressed up in moral authority to target a specific group.
Okay, to ground this in reality, Riker brings up the 2017 Google memo incident involving James Damore.
Yeah, that's a perfect case study for this.
Right, most people following this space are familiar with the broad strokes. Damore was fired after writing an internal memo about ideological echo chambers and sex differences in occupational interests.
But Riker isn't just summarizing the news story here. He's doing a forensic analysis of the HR response mechanism itself.
Okay, break that down.
Well, Riker highlights the profound institutional irony at play. You have Google, a corporation possessing the greatest information retrieval capacity in human history.
Literally, a company whose founding mission is to organize the world's data.
Right. Yet, when confronted with an employee citing mainstream, peer-reviewed psychological and biological research in response to a direct solicitation for feedback. By the way, the institutional immune system treated the empirical data as a physical threat.
So Damore wasn't fired for poor coding.
No, he was fired for introducing unauthorized reality into a closed system.
Unauthorized reality. Riker calls this a zone of enforced unreality, doesn't he?
Yes, enforced unreality. It's a space where the simple act of citing objective data is mechanically processed by the institution as an act of aggression.
Because if an HR department defines equity as identical outcomes, then any data explaining why identical outcomes are statistically improbable becomes a threat to their mandate.
Exactly.
But wait, how did this inversion take hold? I mean, the shift from individual adjudication at Nuremberg to enforced unreality in Silicon Valley, that didn't just happen overnight in a vacuum.
No, it didn't. Riker traces a historical timeline demonstrating that this inversion advanced in stages, and it always utilized the vocabulary of compassion to expand its jurisdiction.
The vocabulary of compassion.
Yeah. He points to a critical pivot around the time of the 1965 Moynihan Report.
The Negro family. The case for national action.
Right. The report itself was an attempt to document a brewing crisis of family structure and fatherlessness. But Riker argues that the sociological response to this report set a dangerous template.
How so?
Instead of reinforcing the necessity of the nuclear family, the sociological apparatus began to pathologize traditional family structures themselves.
They shifted the diagnostic lens. Instead of looking at father absence as a crisis, they began to analyze the father-present household as a potential site of sociological dysfunction.
That is the exact mechanism Riker identifies. And by the 1980s and 1990s, this diagnostic lens had metastasized throughout academia and social work.
So the role of the male provider was reframed through the lens of patriarchal control.
Yes, paternal authority was recast as inherent domestic tyranny. Riker argues that by redefining the productive, protective male, not as the foundational building block of society, but as the primary problem to be managed.
They created a permanent, self-sustaining justification to extract compliance, authority, and resources from him under the banner of societal restitution.
Exactly.
Wow. Okay, so if you're going to fundamentally invert the definition of justice from individual acts to collective guilt, the tools you use to achieve that inversion aren't physical weapons, right?
No, they're words.
Right. Riker argues that whoever controls the dictionary controls the culture. Which brings us to his deep dive into the mutilation of language.
This is such a vital component of his architectural audit. To capture an institution, you have to capture its communication systems.
Makes sense.
Riker leans heavily on the Mott and Bailey doctrine to explain the tactical execution of this capture.
I know that concept is familiar in debate circles, but how does he apply it to HR?
He applies it specifically to the mechanics of institutional HR and diversity policies. The mechanism relies on a constant strategic retreat.
Okay, so the Mott is the highly defensible, universally agreeable statement, right? Like, we just want fairness, equality of opportunity, and a safe workplace.
Exactly. And the Bailey is the radical operational reality. European men must be structurally subordinated, their historical achievements systematically dismantled, and their positions redistributed based on demographic quotas.
And the genius of that tactic and why it's so difficult to combat in a corporate setting is how it completely bypasses logical scrutiny.
Right. Because the moment an employee challenges the radical policy in the Bailey, say, questioning a hiring quota that explicitly excludes men, the administrative apparatus immediately retreats to the Mott.
They accuse the employee of being against fairness or safety.
Yeah. Riker argues that institutions have fundamentally failed because they refuse to force these ideological frameworks to hold a single, consistent position.
They allow the constant retreat to the language of compassion while permitting the execution of policies of exclusion.
Precisely. And he takes this further by examining the hijacking of the trivium.
The classical educational foundation of grammar, logic, and rhetoric.
Right. He claims that modern institutional vocabulary has been intentionally hollowed out and rewired to detonate on impact. Words that once possessed stable, objective definitions have been transformed into ideological triggers.
Like the word safety.
Exactly. When a modern university administration uses the word safety, they are no longer referring to protection from physical harm. The operational definition is the immediate suppression of any disagreement that causes emotional friction.
And inclusion has been mechanically redefined to mean strict, uniform ideological conformity.
While equity, which once implied a fair process, now dictates proportional exclusion to engineer an equal outcome.
He provides a truly staggering example of this linguistic capture by analyzing a controversial infographic released by a Smithsonian institution.
Oh, the one regarding white culture.
Yeah, the exhibit took universal civilizational virtues traits like hard work, punctuality, objective, rational, linear thinking, the scientific method, delayed gratification, and explicitly categorized them as characteristics of whiteness.
And because the broader ideological framework had already defined whiteness as inherently oppressive, these universal virtues were suddenly recoded as mechanisms of racial domination.
The logical implications of that specific categorization are profound.
They really are. Riker unpacks how this breaks down the very concept of merit.
Right, because if hard work and the scientific method are categorized as traits of whiteness, and whiteness is categorized as oppression,
then demanding hard work or objective reasoning in a workplace or a university is mechanically processed as a form of racial violence.
It's an audacious linguistic capture. They didn't just change the rules of the institution, they changed the foundational meaning of the words required to even discuss the rules.
Exactly.
So if we follow Riker's argument to its logical conclusion, the slogans we see constantly, like silence is violence, aren't just catchy phrases for protest signs.
No, they are deliberate, engineered violations of the law of non-contradiction.
Right. You literally, physically cannot be both silent and violent at the exact same moment. But by forcing people to accept a contradiction as truth, you break down their reliance on their own rational faculties.
Which is incredibly destabilizing.
So the question becomes, how is an individual supposed to survive, let alone thrive, in an environment where basic grammar and logic have been weaponized against them?
Well, Riker's highly focused on operational survival here. He argues that trying to debate within a captured linguistic framework is a trap.
So what's the solution?
He instructs the reader to build a personal index of oppression.
Okay, what does that mean in practice?
It means shifting your mindset from a defensive posture to that of an active investigator. You must translate institutional doublespeak into its actual operational meaning in real time.
So when you read a corporate memo declaring a new commitment to equity,
You must mentally cross out the word equity and insert the operational reality, proportional exclusion.
it's about refusing to accept the institution's framing.
Exactly. And he warns readers to be hyper-aware of the Kafka trap.
Named after Franz Kafka's The Trial,
Yeah.
right?
In performance reviews or disciplinary hearings, the Kafka trap is a mechanism where your denial of a charge is treated as the ultimate undeniable proof of your guilt.
So if you are accused of implicit bias and you calmly present evidence that you have no bias,
The HR apparatus will use your calm denial as evidence of your fragility or defensiveness, thereby proving the original charge.
wow. The mechanism is designed so that the only acceptable response is a total surrender of your reality.
And Riker's advice is absolute. Completely refuse the theater of it. Refuse to apologize for observable facts.
Because he warns that an apology in a modern institutional show trial is never received as an expression of genuine remorse.
Never. It is mechanically processed as a signed confession. And the tribunal will immediately use that as its central exhibit to terminate your employment or expel you from the university.
You cannot appease a system that is structurally designed to process your existence as a liability.
You just can't.
Okay, so once justice was inverted and the language was captured, the next logical step in Riker's audit is examining how the procedural safeguards of the law were systematically dismantled.
Right, because to process this new form of justice, the old rules of evidence had to be destroyed.
And he illustrates this with a deeply evocative historical analogy, the 1867 Marquess of Queensberry rules.
It's a really vital comparison for understanding due process.
Yeah, because before the Queensberry rules, boxing was essentially bare-knuckle brawling, right? Just a brutal, unconstrained exercise in raw human aggression.
Exactly. But the introduction of padded gloves, 3-minute rounds, a neutral referee, and the strict prohibition against striking a downed opponent, it didn't make the combat less real.
No, it civilized the violence. It transformed a chaotic brawl into a regulated test of skill.
Right. And Riker argues that procedural due process performs the exact same function for the human impulse toward retaliation.
Because due process, like the presumption of innocence, the right to cross-examine your accuser, the requirement of objective evidence, these rules exist to restrain our darkest instincts.
They force society to pause and verify before destroying a life.
But modern institutions, Riker argues, they've kept the boxing ring, they've kept the audience, but they completely removed the rules.
They permit ideological combatants to strike below the belt relentlessly.
While the accused men are expected to step into the ring with their hands tied, expecting a fair fight that the institution has already rigged.
And Riker traces the codification of this ruleless arena to a specific bureaucratic mechanism, the 20 Oven Dear Colleague letter.
Issued by the Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights.
Right, and this wasn't a law passed by Congress. It was a policy directive.
But it utilized the threat of withholding federal funding under Title IX to force universities to fundamentally alter their internal judicial processes.
Exactly. The letter mandated that universities adopt the preponderance of the evidence standard for sexual misconduct proceedings.
Let's break down the legal mechanics of that standard for a second, because in a criminal court, you need beyond a reasonable doubt.
Right.
And in civil cases involving severe consequences, you often need clear and convincing evidence.
But the preponderance of the evidence standard, that simply means 50.01% certainty.
It is a literal coin flip with a microscopic thumb on the scale.
Yeah. And universities were pressured not just to lower the evidentiary standard, but to actively eliminate the accused's right to cross-examination.
And deny them active legal representation during the hearings.
The mechanism of establishing truth was just completely gutted.
And Riker points to extensive data from FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, to back this up.
Yes. They have documented hundreds of cases between 2011 and 2024 where male students were suspended or permanently expelled based on shifting, uncorroborated, or contradictory accounts.
These young men were routinely denied the right to see the evidence against them.
Denied the right to present exculpatory evidence.
And denied the ability to question the narratives of their accusers. Riker describes the mechanical outcome of this policy as a conveyor belt of conviction.
Where the raw material is a mere accusation, and the finished product is the destruction of a young man's academic and professional future.
And he fiercely critiques the modern mantras of safetyism and believe all women.
According to his framework, those are not principles of justice. They're explicit demands to discard the presumption of innocence entirely.
They require an institutional apparatus to equate subjective emotional discomfort with objective physical violence. But, this brings me back to the question of intent. Surely the Title IX coordinators and university administrators enforcing these rules genuinely believe they're protecting vulnerable students from harm.
Of course, they probably do.
So how does Riker separate their perceived good intentions from the devastating structural outcomes he describes?
Well, Riker insists that when auditing a system, intention is just a distraction.
A distraction.
Yeah. The mechanical outcome is all that matters. He states that compassion without justice is simply tyranny wearing a concerned expression.
Tyranny wearing a concerned expression. That's a heavy line.
It is. If the architecture of a university tribunal mechanically produces convictions without corroborating evidence, the subjective feelings of the administrators are totally irrelevant.
Because the outcome is structurally predetermined.
Exactly. So his actionable advice to men facing these tribunals is radical. Do not attempt to appease the administration.
Because attempting to appease them operates on the false assumption that you are dealing with a legitimate neutral institution acting in good faith.
Right. An institution that actively conceals exculpatory evidence and denies you legal counsel has already abandoned good faith.
So what are men supposed to do?
Riker advises men to immediately turn the institution's own legal architecture against itself. Do not play the game within their rigged internal tribunal.
File formal Title IX and Title VII federal grievances against the universities or corporations themselves, alleging systemic sex discrimination.
Yes. Demand that they meet the very evidentiary standards they publicly claim to uphold.
By dragging the internal bureaucracy into the harsh light of an actual federal courtroom, you force them to legally produce their biased training documents and procedural mechanisms.
Exposing their hypocrisy on public record.
Okay, so we've focused heavily on campus environments and corporate HR up to this point. But Riker's argument expands much further, right?
Much further. He claims that this dismantling of due process and equal protection isn't just localized to universities. It is hard-coded into the criminal justice system and the civic fabric at a federal level.
He directly assaults the pervasive cultural concept of male privilege.
Yeah, he conducts a meticulous audit of the legal system to argue that the institutional ledger is not balanced in favor of men. It is, in fact, balanced heavily in favor of women.
And he relies on federal data to establish the mechanics of this asymmetry. Let's look at the sentencing disparities.
Right, using data from the United States Sentencing Commission. The data from 2017 demonstrates that men receive sentences approximately 63% longer than women.
Wait, 63% longer?
Yes. For committing the exact same federal offenses, even after rigorously controlling for criminal history, offense type, and prior convictions.
We really need to pause on that number, 63% longer. Mechanically, that is the difference between a woman serving 3 years for a crime and a man serving nearly 8 years for the exact same action under the exact same circumstances.
It's a massive systemic application of a lethal double standard.
And Riker juxtaposes that criminal justice disparity with the civic obligations enforced by the Selective Service System.
Yeah, he points to the mechanics of the 1981 Supreme Court case, Ross-Strunker v. Goldberg.
Under current federal law, every 18-year-old male in the United States is legally mandated to register for the draft.
And failure to offer your body to the state carries the threat of felony charges.
Massive financial penalties.
And the permanent loss of access to federal student aid and government employment.
But women, conversely, are entirely exempt.
Right. Riker defines this mechanic as a ceiling on obligation. Women have a permanent, legally codified exit from the ultimate civic liability.
While men operate under a legally enforced hierarchy of sacrifice,
Exactly. And then he unpacks the mechanics of the Duluth model of domestic violence response.
which was developed in the 1980s and adopted by law enforcement agencies across the country.
Yeah. The Duluth model literally trains responding police officers to identify a primary aggressor.
But the training operates on a deeply baked sociological assumption, right?
Right. The assumption that male violence is an instrumental, systemic tool of patriarchal control, while female violence is merely reactive or defensive.
So mechanically, a police officer arrives at a chaotic scene. A man could be physically bleeding from a defensive wound.
But because the officer's institutional training runs the situation through the Duluth algorithm, the man is fundamentally perceived as the aggressor who lost control of his victim.
And he is the one who ends up in handcuffs.
Exactly. Riker is essentially saying that in the legal sphere, men are forced to fight bare-knuckled against the power of the state.
While women step into the ring wearing heavily padded gloves provided by that very same state.
That analogy perfectly captures the systemic asymmetry Riker is diagnosing.
So he takes all of these structural realities, sentencing disparities, draft immunity, biased law enforcement algorithms, and deploys a very strict formal syllogism to finalize his point.
Yeah, let me walk you through the mechanics of that syllogism.
Okay.
Premise 1. A legally privileged class is defined as a demographic that possesses unique immunities, specialized legal leniency, and state-funded protections not available to others.
Okay, premise 1 makes sense.
Premise 2. Under current federal law and practice, women possess total draft immunity, serve 63% shorter prison sentences for identical crimes, and are the beneficiaries of dedicated, gender-specific federal protections.
Like the Violence Against Women Act.
Exactly. So the logical conclusion, therefore, under the objective mechanical letter of the law, men are the dispossessed, legally burdened class, while women operate as the legally privileged class.
It's an airtight logical progression if you accept the premises, which he backs with federal data.
Right.
He also points to the media apparatus to show how this profound legal asymmetry is culturally maintained and obfuscated.
He introduces the three-question media test as a tool for the reader.
Right. When you are reading a mainstream news story about a crime or a tragedy, mechanically ask yourself, what is the race and sex of the perpetrator?
What is the race and sex of the victim?
And crucially, would the framing, the tone, and the volume of the coverage be identical if those demographic roles were completely reversed?
He applies this test to the tragic 2021 Waukesha Christmas parade attack, arguing that the media's framing of the event was a masterclass in narrative engineering rather than objective news reporting.
Because the goal, he asserts, is for the media to actively manage the public perception of who is culturally permitted to be recognized as a victim.
Which brings us to the most massive cultural paradox Riker addresses.
Yeah, if his audit is accurate, if men are measurably dispossessed in the legal sphere, the civic sphere, and the health sphere, why does the entirety of modern society still operate on the unquestioned atmospheric assumption that we live in an oppressive patriarchy?
Exactly. If the raw data points resolutely in one direction, how does the cultural consensus manage to scream the exact opposite?
How does an institution survive when its founding narrative is directly contradicted by objective reality?
Riker's answer is structural. He argues that this paradox exists because feminism morphed from a necessary, legitimate legal liberation movement into a massive, self-preserving, heavily funded bureaucracy.
He diagnoses the modern movement as an institutional anachronism.
To explain the mechanics of this, he lays out a timeline of legal victory.
1920. The 19th Amendment guarantees women the right to vote.
1963. The Equal Pay Act mandates equal pay for equal work.
1964. Title VII, the Civil Rights Act, prohibits employment discrimination based on sex.
In 1972. Title IX prohibits sex-based discrimination in any school or education program receiving federal money.
So Riker asserts that by the mid-1980s, the entire legal architecture required for absolute formal equality was completely and thoroughly achieved.
The war was decisively won. The foundational objectives were secured.
But here is the mechanical problem with bureaucracies. Institutions rarely, if ever, dissolve themselves willingly once their initial objective is achieved.
Over decades, the feminist movement had constructed a massive societal apparatus.
They established deeply entrenched academic departments, powerful political lobbying groups, and a vast network of NGOs dependent on government grants.
Right, so if they had simply declared victory in the 1980s, that entire multi-billion-dollar apparatus would have lost its justification for existing.
The funding would have stopped. The academic departments would have been shuttered.
So to ensure their own survival, they executed what Riker calls the bureaucratic pivot.
Instead of disbanding, the bureaucracy simply refined the mechanics of oppression.
Right, because oppression used to have an objective legal definition, like being barred by statute from voting, owning property, or holding a specific job.
But suddenly, the definition was expanded into the subjective realm. The new targets of the bureaucracy became microaggressions.
The concept of manspreading on public transit,
The theory of the male gaze in media,
debates over who performs invisible emotional labor in a household.
and even the temperature settings of office thermostats. Riker argues the bureaucracy had to mechanically manufacture new, ever-expanding forms of grievance in order to justify its ongoing federal funding and societal authority.
And Riker systematically takes aim at the core tenets that justify this ongoing bureaucratic existence,
Yeah.
like the wage gap.
Oh, right. He dissects the concept of the wage gap. He relies heavily on the landmark 2014 research of Harvard economist Claudia Golden.
Yeah, Golden's research applied rigorous multivariate analysis to the wage data. She demonstrated that when you mechanically control for variables like occupational choices, temporal flexibility,
Hours worked per week, dangerous working conditions.
and time voluntarily taken out of the workforce for family, the residual wage gap shrinks to statistical insignificance.
So Riker states that the unadjusted 77 cents on the dollar statistic isn't an empirical fact. It is a mechanical liturgy repeated by a bureaucracy to secure funding.
Exactly. He also audits the data on health and happiness, and the findings are deeply counterintuitive to the prevailing cultural narrative.
Yeah, he brings up the General Social Survey, which has rigorously tracked self-reported happiness in the United States since 1972.
The data shows that women's self-reported happiness has steadily declined over the last 5 decades.
Both in absolute terms and relative to men's happiness. And this decline occurred simultaneously with the total institutional capture of society by feminist frameworks.
Meanwhile, the data on male outcomes is grim. Men on average die 5 to 6 years younger than women,
They suffer from significantly higher rates of workplace fatalities.
and they have suicide rates roughly 3.5 times higher than women.
Yet, despite these glaring discrepancies in mortality and health outcomes, the National Institutes of Health established a heavily funded Office of Research on Women's Health in 1990.
And there is absolutely no federal equivalent dedicated to men's health.
Riker points to the total collapse of logic here.
Yeah, if a societal movement observes a specific demographic that is killing itself at nearly 4 times the rate of others, dying younger from almost all top 10 causes of death,
Accounting for over 90% of workplace fatalities and receiving sentences that are 63% longer for identical crimes.
and the movement still concludes that that specific demographic is the uniquely privileged one, then the word privilege has been entirely severed from objective reality.
It has become a meaningless religious incantation rather than a sociological metric.
To mechanically dismantle this rhetorical programming, Riker arms his readers with what he calls the Name the Statue challenge.
Oh, this is a great conversational tool.
Yeah, he suggests that if you are speaking with someone who passionately claims that systemic oppression against women is currently active and codified in modern Western society, you should calmly ask them to name one specific active legal statute or right that a man currently possesses today that a woman does not.
Based on his framework, why is the specific tactical challenge so effective?
It's effective because it forces an immediate structural gear shift. It cuts entirely through the atmospheric vibes, the emotional rhetoric, and the subjective feelings of oppression.
It drags the conversation out of the murky realm of sociology and forces it onto the hard, verifiable ground of objective legal reality.
Exactly. Because as Riker's audit demonstrates, no such statute exists.
The challenge mechanically exposes the absurdity of the grievance bureaucracy.
It highlights the anachronism of applying 1850s marital property standards, an era when women legitimately could not hold independent credit or serve on juries, to a 2020s corporate environment where women earn the significant majority of university degrees and possess identical legal rights.
It reveals the grievance machine as a historical reenactment society, rather than a modern civil rights movement.
Right?
All right, so up to this point in our deep dive, we have forensically mapped Riker's diagnosis. We've examined the mechanical inversion of Nuremberg justice from individual action to collective guilt.
We've explored the semantic trap of hijacked language.
We've audited the dismantling of due process on campuses. We've looked at the stark legal asymmetry in federal sentencing and civic duty.
And we've analyzed the anachronistic, self-preserving bureaucracy of modern feminism.
But Riker's book doesn't end with a diagnosis. He doesn't just leave his readers standing in the ruins of captured institutions.
No, the final section of the book pivots sharply toward a concrete, mechanical, actionable solution. He titles it The New Order: How to Build What Comes Next.
And he begins this final chapter with a very stern structural warning, specifically directed at the men reading his book, particularly those in the manosphere who consume endless content about institutional bias.
He warns that rage without architecture is nothing but performance theater.
Endlessly arguing with a grievance bureaucracy in the comment sections of the internet is a catastrophic tactical error.
Because simply participating in the debate on their terms concedes their foundational moral premise, that they possess the legitimate authority to judge you in the first place.
Right. So if arguing is a trap, what is the mechanical alternative?
He reaches back into deep history to provide a blueprint, drawing a parallel to Benedict of Nursia in 529 AD.
The historical context here is vital. The Roman Empire, the greatest institutional structure the world had ever known, was undergoing a terminal collapse.
The aqueducts were failing, the political senate was reduced to a corrupt museum piece, and basic civic order was disintegrating.
But Benedict didn't write angry petitions to the invading Visigoths complaining about their hypocrisy.
He didn't stand in the ruins of the Forum demanding the barbarians respect the old laws.
Instead, he gathered like-minded men, established a strict, rigorous rule of life, and physically built monasteries at places like Monte Cassino.
The mechanics of what those monasteries achieved is the core of Riker's solution. Those Benedictine structures didn't just survive the collapse. They actively preserved the inheritance of Western civilization.
The monks painstakingly copied the texts of Aristotle and Cicero.
They maintained the trivium.
They developed complex crop rotation techniques, preserved advanced agricultural knowledge, and engineered brewing methods to ensure a safe, sanitary water supply throughout the chaos of the Middle Ages.
They held the line between civilization and the Dark Ages. But they didn't achieve this by protesting the barbarians.
They achieved it by physically building an alternative parallel structure of order that outlasted the civilizational collapse for over 1,000 years.
Riker calls this strategy the Benedictine option.
And he applies the mechanics of the Benedictine option directly to our modern educational crisis. He draws a devastating contrast between a modern public school graduate and a classically educated student.
According to his audit, the public school graduate is mechanically processed by an institution that teaches them that Western civilization is uniquely and historically evil,
That biological reality is merely a linguistic construct.
and that any intellectual disagreement is tantamount to physical violence.
Conversely, the classical student is taught the mechanics of the trivium. They read the Iliad, they learn how to parse formal, logical syllogisms, and they are required to orally defend a thesis against rigorous questioning.
Riker argues that the first student is the mechanical product of civilizational collapse.
While the second student is a vessel actively transmitting a vital inheritance to the next generation.
This historical and educational framework leads directly to his actionable steps. Riker urges men to immediately cease playing a zero-sum societal game that is mathematically and structurally rigged for them to lose.
He advocates for a systematic, mechanical withdrawal of compliance.
Pull your children out of compromised, ideologically captured educational systems.
Form resilient financial structures and trusts that are legally insulated from the biases of modern family courts.
Forge real-world, local alliances with like-minded men.
Stop seeking validation from institutions that despise you and start actively building alternative, parallel institutions.
But let's ground this in practical reality, because it is very easy to write, build a new society, on the final page of a manifesto.
Exactly. What are the actual mechanics of that for an average guy reading this book? A guy who just wants to go to his job, pay his mortgage, provide for his family, and raise his kids in peace? Is Riker demanding that men sell their homes and become off-grid survivalists living in the woods?
No, Riker is highly specific in clarifying this point. He is absolutely not advocating for withdrawal into physical isolation.
Good to know.
And he vehemently attacks the impulse to retreat into the digital void of internet anger, which he mockingly describes as surrender wearing a leather jacket.
So the Benedictine option isn't about running away.
It is about active, local, mechanical replacement. It means reasserting absolute authority over the jurisdiction of your own household, the intellectual formation of your own mind, and the immediate reality of your local community.
It means mechanically refusing to fund and refusing to apologize to any institution that explicitly targets men for systemic disadvantage.
Right. You do not have to move to the woods to execute this. You simply have to stop outsourcing your moral judgment and the formation of your children to an administrative class that views your existence as a problem to be solved.
It is fundamentally about the power of withholding. It's about withdrawing your compliance, your intellectual labor, and your resources from the grievance machine.
Which brings us to a really interesting point.
Yeah, which brings me to a final, incredibly provocative thought that I want to leave you, the listener, with today. Building on Riker's concept of this new order, consider the absolute mechanics of civilizational maintenance.
It's a huge question.
What exactly happens to the structural integrity of a society when the very demographic that traditionally builds, maintains, and funds its physical, economic, and technological infrastructure decides to quietly walk away and build a parallel world?
If the grievance bureaucracy fundamentally requires male labor, male innovation, and male tax dollars to function and fund itself, can that machine survive the cold, mechanical apathy of the very men it constantly accuses?
It is a question of pure civilizational physics.
It is a profound, unavoidable question of structural load bearing. If you systematically alienate the builders, the building eventually collapses under its own weight.
And it is exactly the kind of structural question that Conrad Riker is forcing his readers to confront. As a reminder, today's extensive deep dive covered the highly provocative, deeply analytical ebook Nuremberg Trials of Feminism. Anti-Racism is Racism Against Europeans by Conrad Riker.
If you want to dive into the raw federal data, examine the historical comparisons we unpacked, and review the legal audits for yourself, check it out.
Yes, I highly encourage you to check Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books right now to purchase and read the book in its entirety.
The arguments are structurally dense, and seeing the citations and mechanical breakdowns firsthand is incredibly valuable for anyone attempting to map the realities of this current cultural moment.
Absolutely. And if you want to follow the author's ongoing structural analysis of current events and read his unvarnished commentary as it happens, make sure you follow at Conrad Riker on Substack.
Definitely worth a follow.
Thank you so much for joining us on this massive deep dive into some incredibly heavy, challenging, and mechanically complex source material. Please give us a like, hit subscribe so you don't miss our next deep dive into the foundational sources shaping our culture, and keep asking the hard questions about how the world actually works. We will see you next time.